And on a day when the government has unveiled their atmanirbhar package 3.0, stimulus 3.0, I'm joined by the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. K. Subramanian. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Subramanian. Just a day ago, the Reserve Bank of India confirms that we are in recession. The economy has contracted for 2 successive quarters, and then today the government announces another stimulus. Is there a coincidence? Is the government trying to talk up the economy at difficult times? How do you see today's announcements?
Ashdeep, the announcement by the Reserve Bank of India is something that was along expected lines. As we've discussed earlier on your channel, this is an unprecedented time that we are going through, during the pandemic, and every country in the world is affected, and that's something that's what the Reserve Bank has talked about. The stimulus package, though, was being worked on long before this announcement. So they're possibly correlated events, but no causation there.
But how do you see the announcements that were made today? Will they really kickstart the economy? The worry is that the critical concern is, in a way, reviving consumption, reviving demand, and there is uncertainty whether these stimuli package will actually do that. Are they really tackling the core concerns of demand and consumption-led growth?
Rajdeep, a couple of points before I actually mention that. I think during the unlock phase, the economy has displayed robust recovery, especially the manufacturing sector. If you look at the IIP numbers that have just come in today, the IIP print, for the first time in 6 months, it has actually grown, so it's in positive territory. The manufacturing sector, many of the high frequency indicators that we track.
Very marginally, if I may add, very marginally, if I may add.
Yes, but compared to almost an 8% decline, remember this is the, we are talking about the V-shaped recovery, right? After the lockdown, and the previous month was a decline of almost 8.7%. So from about 37 odd % decline in the month of April, it has significantly come back. And if you look at the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, it was at a 7-year high in the month of September for manufacturing, and has since grown. The GST numbers at 105 lakh crore actually are greater than the last year's numbers. So, even if we, let's say...
no, that's because of deferment of GST. No, that's because of deferment of GST. Sorry to intervene again. The numbers are high because of deferment of GST in the month of September. My worry is the government is cherry picking the numbers. Why not accept that the recession remains a problem and the recovery is not V-shaped but very gradual?
No, Rajdeep, I am speaking based on the data and the high frequency indicators that we track. As I had mentioned earlier as well, if you look at the various indicators for manufacturing, clearly there is a recovery that is on, and that recovery is following a decline that happened, during the lockdown. So what I wanted to actually, finish the point was that there is a 2-phased recovery that is on, with manufacturing being clearly robust and displaying buoyancy because of the reforms, significant reforms that have been launched as well. If you notice, India is the only economy that has recognized that the COVID pandemic can be different from other economic episodes, and there may be a potential impact of growth, and that is why India has been fast to actually unleash reforms so that the growth does not get impacted. So the buoyancy that you are seeing in manufacturing is also because of the expectation of growth from the reforms that have been launched. That said, now let me come to answering your original question, which is about the impact of, on demand of these stimulus measures. As I've mentioned earlier as well, if you look at the data on the PMJDY balances, for instance, putting cash in the hands of people is not necessarily going to be as effective in pushing demand. But when you have employment increasing, that is something that can really help in bringing demand, because it provides a stability of income. And as you were mentioning, the pandemic actually creates significant uncertainty, and that is something that we have to work on. So in that sense, the job creation program that has been announced is something that is actually quite useful. The tax rebates on housing, for less than 2 crores is also something that is useful, because that has spillover effects on construction activity, creates spillover effects in many other sectors. So those will also be useful in terms of the improvement in demand. And if you look at the upward revisions that are happening in the GDP growth, some of this is reflecting the revisions in demand. But let's do acknowledge that that we are still amidst the pandemic, and the pandemic is not over. So this is an economic crisis that has happened because of the health crisis, which creates its own uncertainty, something that we have to acknowledge.
The criticism, Dr. Subramanian, is that the government's focus in most of these stimuli packages has largely been on supply side. The critics say that, you have to put cash in hands, especially in the hands of those outside the formal economy, the poor and the vulnerable. You need those income guarantee schemes. The government hasn't been able to do that. Yes, you are claiming that today's announcements will stimulate growth, will bring in jobs, but the fact is unemployment still remains very high at 6.4%. So given the scale of the problem, is the government unable to, in a way, address the real crisis of demand, of income, of providing cash in the hands of people?
As I was saying, Rajdeep, the measures, the ones that have been focused on today, especially jobs is a clear demand side measure. Similarly, if you look at the housing, those are also actually, as they create activity downstream, these are measures that are intended to help on the demand side. As we've recognized that is something that has to be it has to be accelerated. Given the recovery that is already happening, the intent is to try and accelerate that further by bringing these demand side measures.
But why the reluctance to put cash in hand? Why the reluctance to put cash in hand? The former Finance Minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram's criticism constantly has been that. Why is the government reluctant to put income in the hands of the most vulnerable?
Because it's not clear that cash in hand will necessarily in demand. Because if you look at the the balances in the the PMJDY accounts, the deposits, the way they've increased, and the simple economic concept that faced with uncertainty, individual households will always choose to actually save, because they anticipate, what if one of us becomes sick? They will actually save. So what is really important is assured income in order to push demand, and that is extremely critical. So I think the evidence that cash in hand may accelerate demand is not really very much there, and that is why this emphasis on employment, and through that to try and boost demand.
Yesterday the RBI report in its risk to the recovery that you're talking about referred to 3 aspects: unrelenting pressure of inflation, the fact that there could be a second wave of COVID-19 and this could have its own impact, as well as intensifying stress among households and corporations that could spill over into the financial sector. Do you see these risks as still very real? And to that extent, despite the claim of a V-shaped recovery, we need to be much more cautious?
I actually absolutely want to be cautiously optimistic. My intention is to actually point out things that are actually, that are showing up well. But at the same time, we have to be cautiously optimistic, because the possibility of, of a second wave is something that we certainly have to guard against. As I said earlier, we still are amidst the pandemic. The other countries, especially European countries, are seeing a resurgence in cases. We're going into winter, festive season, people, if they drop their guards, that may be something that we have to guard against. So I absolutely am being cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, it is important to also acknowledge what we are seeing in the data. That is what my intent is in pointing this out.
Sure, but the worry, Dr. Subramanian, is to look at the glass half empty as well, particularly the services sector and the MSMEs. The MSMEs still do not seem to have the confidence to put the get the investors back and to put investment into many of these small micro companies. And you've got a situation where the service sector, hospitality, tourism are still hurting. They're still waiting, they're saying, for a package that will revive these particular sectors.
So Rajdeep, I think what we have to acknowledge is that some of these sectors like hospitality, tourism, because of the effect of social distancing, the demand shock is very large, and that's something which we have to acknowledge. And therefore, if you look at the service sector PMI, right? For the first time in 7 months now, the Purchasing Managers Index has reached about 53. It's actually in an expansionary category. This is despite some of the sectors like travel and tourism still suffering the impact of the pandemic and the need for social distancing. That is something that we cannot deny. That's something that we have to acknowledge. But it is important to take into account that the measures that have been taken now are actually trying to boost demand. Amidst a recovery that is indeed happening. Yes, it is two-phased with manufacturing leading and services behind, but there is a way that is happening.
One of your predecessors, Dr. Kaushik Basu, has been very critical, saying that the government has not been able to take advantage, has not been able to address the real concerns of the economy. His belief is that India is doing much worse than other countries even around it in the region, Bangladesh being cited as an example. What will you say to the doomsdayers who are saying that we have not handled the pandemic and its impact effectively?
As always, Rajdeep, I actually speak using data. If you look at the per capita numbers, I've mentioned this earlier as well, in terms of the death rate per capita, we've done far better than many other countries. I think it's very important to actually do apples to apples comparisons when we do these. We're a large population, a pandemic, the network effects of a pandemic are much larger in big populations. And when you have especially, population density being very high, and an economy where, a household typically comprised of 5 people, where one person actually suffering the unfortunate consequence of death could mean significant distribution. So when you take all these realities, for India into account, I think we've managed the pandemic very well. And the recovery is indeed going on. And I think, as I said earlier as well, we've been the only country, emerging economy, to recognize that this is a crisis that can indeed impact potential growth, and therefore it is really important to actually take the necessary measures to push growth through reform measures. And look at a seminal set of reforms which I don't think have actually happened in earlier periods, whether it's labor reforms, agriculture reforms. These are important aspects that will really push the economy. If you think about the nature of the economy itself, these reforms are intended to enable the primary and the secondary sectors of the economy, which actually contribute far more to employment. And therefore, we've recognized the nature of the crisis, how it is different from other crises, and we've done the needful, while at the same time also pushing for demand amidst the recovery that is happening.
So looking ahead, do you believe that there will be possibly more stimuli that will be needed, packages needed for, as I said, specifically affected sectors, whether it's hospitality, aviation, textiles? Will there be specific packages, or is there, are there limits, fiscal constraints that perhaps weigh you down at a moment like this?
I think, Rajdeep, fiscal space actually has expanded now because of the external sector. If you looked at the first quarter, the current account, we had a surplus of $19.8 billion. Now, even if we actually have half of that, or even less than that of performance in the remaining 3 quarters, it's likely we will have a current account surplus of about 1.5 to about 1.8%, and that does give you fiscal space. So I think there is space, and as you have seen, this is the third stimulus package. The government has been calibrating, and one of the things that we recognized very early by looking at the Spanish flu pandemic is that this pandemic is not something that is going away in a few months, and therefore it is important to keep ammunition, calibrate the stimulus package, see how things are going, and we are seeing a recovery, and this stimulus will also help that recovery. But as I said, there is fiscal space, and if as we see how things are responding, we have the space to actually respond further if needed.
Let me ask you in conclusion, even pre-COVID, the economy was going through a slowdown. When do you see the economy reaching those pre-COVID levels? Forget about where we were, let's say 18 months ago. When do you actually see that happening? Because you've been cautiously optimistic, talking about a V-shaped recovery.
Which has indeed manifested,
when do you actually see that happening? Over the next quarter, over the next 2 quarters?
Which has indeed manifested, the V-shaped recovery, especially in manufacturing, and our effort here is to try and accelerate that further by providing the stimulus measures. I think that it's quite likely that we should be back to to pre-COVID levels in terms of the overall GDP. Maybe in a year or so, because next year's growth I anticipate it to be higher, and given the reform measures that we've taken, I expect growth to accelerate. I think we have to take that into account, because these are focused on sectors that have hitherto not done as well, which is your agriculture and manufacturing, and these have the potential to create significant jobs and thereby also create demand in the economy. And these are long-run measures, medium to long run, which will really help growth beyond the next year as well. So I think that's something that we must keep in mind.
Dr. Subramanian, as always, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining me and giving us your perspective.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.